All right, guys, here we go. Starting here in topic 0, kind of just a little bit of review here, topic wise. All right, so we talked a little bit about guys like Columbus, Native Americans, colonies in the Americas early on, why they're created, Mayflower Compact, difference between the New England, Middle, and Southern colonies. Christopher Columbus, quote unquote, finds the New World, even though it's probably Leif Erikson, the Vikings. But for European purposes, what our purposes, he technically finds the New World, lands in Central America, the Caribbean area. Sails back and forth a couple times, searching for the West Indies, finds them, thus the Native Americans called Indians. Native Americans, they're here first. They're generally going to either work with the native or with the Europeans or be very much against them. It really just depends on how the Europeans treat them and the views of the Native Americans to begin with. Early American colonies like Roanoke, Jamestown, etc. are in there. Colonies created for religious purposes, profit, things of that nature, expanding colonial possession, etc. Mayflower Compact, we talked a little bit about how it's more or less the first form of government here, written government in the Americas, which the Pilgrims come over, and before they get off the Mayflower, they sign this agreement kind of setting the organization and rules of their colony. New England colonies are going to have a little bit more fishing, timber, manufacturing, and that sort of thing due to the climate and soil. Middle colonies are going to be a little bit of a mixture of the the New England and the southern colonies. With a bit of farming, there's going to be trade, there's going to be fishing, there's going to be sailing, lumber, etc. And you're going to have some religious influence there. And southern colonies are primarily agricultural because of the growing season, the crops, and the soil. So British influence, you got the Magna Carta, aka the Great Charter. Big thing about the Magna Carta is that it limits the king's power. Basically, your leaders, your government must follow the same rules that apply to everybody. This is the first document that really does that. Moving on a little bit, the English Bill of Rights is kind of a precursor to what we have as our Bill of Rights. It is a list of rights that the government guarantees the people. It further limits the power of the kings and monarchs and so forth, and gives a little bit of that power to the parliament and the people. Excuse me. So moving on here to a little bit, we got some English thought in our modern day stuff here. How do we get to a revolution? Well, you got the Enlightenment coming around, where it's all about philosophy, scientific, and actually thinking a little bit, trying to get knowledge. And people start using reason a lot more as opposed to, well, somebody got sick just because the gods were mad. Well, now they're looking for reasons and stuff like that. This really challenges old ways of thinking and gets people thinking critically. You're talking like Ben Franklin, Jefferson, Madison, Washington, Thomas Paine, and a bunch of other Patrick Henry and a bunch of other guys would be falling under this enlightened category. Couple that with the Great Awakening, in which people they start questioning, with religion spreading but being more localized, they start questioning, hey, if I can figure out how to worship God, why can't I rule myself? Why do I have to listen to somebody like a king that's 3,000 miles away? So this just kind of gets people thinking here more than anything, these two ideas. This guy here, John Locke, Life, Liberty, and Property. Jefferson borrows it heavily from him into our Declaration of Independence, Life, Liberty, and Pursuit of Happiness. So actual causes here, apart from the thought process we just touched on. The French and Indian War happens, and it's the French and the Native Americans against the British and the colonists. Long story short, the British defeat the French, but it's a very expensive war. So the British have the idea of, hey, colonists, you're going to pay for this through taxes, Stamp Act, tax on paper, Tea Act, kind of self-explanatory what it's taxing. And a bunch of other taxes that are put in place as well. Colonists aren't really fans of that, especially when you consider that for several years before the French and Indian War, Britain had been busy with their own stuff in Europe, so they kind of let the colonies go a little bit. They were still British subjects and so forth, but they kind of gained a little independence, at least from day-to-day British rule. So furthermore, the British limited some of the rights of the colonists and abused some of them. You've got the Proclamation of 1763, no more westward expansion past really like the Appalachian Mountains. This is done largely because you just got done with the French and Indian War, and if colonists keep moving westward, they're going to run in almost certainly to Native Americans, which will cause further conflicts. This is kind of trying to limit that. Plus, there's a standing army during peacetime, which is never a very popular thing. The redcoats, the British soldiers, are being housed by colonists against their will. They're having to pay for everything. So these things and others really kind of start really upsetting Americans here, or future Americans, I should say. And eventually this leads to the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson writes with a little bit of help from Ben Franklin, John Adams. officially, unofficially approved July 4, 1776. That's when we pretty much say, hey, Britain, we're out of here. We've already had a couple battles by that point. The key with this is it sits there and says, hey, we are independent. We are not with the British Empire. And here are our reasons for doing what we're doing. So what's actually in it? You've got the grievances against the king, basically what the king has been doing wrong. Justification, you can't just go off with a big old revolt and say, hey, we're doing this just because. To get help and support, you need to justify it. Talks about the purpose of a government, which is kind of another shot here at the British. And again, another shot, it also explains the rights of all citizens, all things of which the British government has not been doing very well for us, in our opinion. So you get to the Revolutionary War, and the colonists end up winning. Get a little bit of help from the French there. Treaty of Paris in 1783. Britain agrees that, hey, America is now independent, and boundaries are set for the new country. But the British are gone. What do we do now? Well, we've got to figure out a government. We have the Articles of Confederation, our first written form of government in the new United States. It's a loose alliance of kind of independent states of sorts, and that the states are going to be very powerful individually, and the central government, the national government, is going to be pretty weak. This is going to be kind of problematic because they can't collect taxes, no interstate trade, no regulating currency, so trade within the states is going to be very difficult. And most of the powers relate to individual states. So they go to sit there and think about, here's a list of all the issues and the outcome of these issues. They go to talk about this, and they eventually decide they just need to start over. But there is something good that comes from the Northwest Ordinance here. It's not all bad. The Northwest Ordinance is basically a way to set up the territory west of the Appalachian Mountains, all this new territory, organize it into townships, etc. And this is used for several years. So when you consider the fact this is late 1700s, this is pretty impressive to organize this thing, all these states and territories as well as they did. Constitution here, there's a convention held, and the goal is initially to reform it. However, the delegates realize there's just so many problems with this. Let's just create something new. They end up creating the Constitution, which we still got today, but they do disagree on several issues there you can see listed at the bottom of the screen. So we've got the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan that they create this type of government where they both want a stronger national government. Jumping ahead here, they both want three different branches of power separated. But the New Jersey plan for the smaller states wants a unicameral legislature, meaning just one house, where representation is based on just one vote, one state. Bicameral in the Virginia plan here is favored by the big states, where the representation you get is based off population. The Great Compromise here is going to kind of say why say or when you can say and mash the two together. It's going to give us a bicameral legislature, which we still have today in Congress, in which you have the House of Representatives, which is based off population, and the Senate, which is based off of one state, one vote kind of concept with two senators from each state. That's the Great Compromise, aka also known as the Connecticut Compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise, you had an issue with slavery here, where the southern states wanted to count slaves as representation, even though they didn't really view them as people on an otherwise basis, where the North's like, no, that's ridiculous. So they end up compromising in order to get the Constitution ratified, and they come with Three-Fifths Compromise, meaning that 3 out of every 5 slaves will count towards representation. This is a big one for the South, not so much the North, but it does get the Constitution formed, which is nice. So in order to finally ratify it, the Federalist versus Anti-Federalist debate springs up. Federalists want that strong national government. Anti-Federalists are more concerned about the abuse of power and opposed to ratification. They're more in favor of reforming and rehashing the Articles. So we talked about the Federalist Papers and everything in here. In general, you guys can read these, and they're going to give you a pretty good idea of why our government is the way it is. Why do the Anti-Federalists really not want the Constitution, though? It's because there's no Bill of Rights. They're concerned that without kind of like that English Bill of Rights in the late 1600s, without specifically listing all the rights that we have as people, they will be abused. Eventually, what it comes down to is James Madison draws up a Bill of Rights. The Federalists agree to it, gets approved, and boom, we have a Constitution and a new official government here. Things in the Constitution: popular sovereignty, power to the people get to vote on topics, separation of powers, you don't want too much power in one place, 3 branches, limited government, meaning that the government gets only the power of the Constitution and thus the people give it. Federalism, national federal government, and you're going to have state governments sharing the power. Checks and balances, meaning each branch of government has power over the other, so no one branch gets too powerful. And representative government simply means that you guys are represented in the government. You elect somebody who then they go to Congress and they elect you. In our two-party system, you got the Federalist Party initially, probably a bit more of a Democratic Party today when you consider the stronger government thing and the national bank. The Democratic Republicans, the other major one to begin with, they're a little more like modern-day Republicans. So you've got that going on here, and you got the Louisiana Purchase made by Thomas Jefferson from Napoleon of France. $15 million, virtually doubles the size of the United States. It's a pretty nice deal for us. Very, very cheap. Then you got Marbury versus Madison that brings up the concept of judicial review. And what it more or less essentially states is just that the Supreme Court has the ability to review laws and actions of the president, Congress, etc., to determine whether they are constitutional or not. Probably a pretty good idea to be able to do this. War of 1812 comes around due to British sailors impressing Americans, forcing them to serve in the British Navy, which we don't really like. War ends about 3 years later and doesn't really do much as far as territory, financial stuff, gain and loss, but it does make us seem to be a stable country. And then you've got the Monroe Doctrine. There's examples of it being used down at the bottom of the slide here. But it says, hey, America, we got this half of the world over in the Western Hemisphere, North, Central, and South America taken care of. Europe, stay out of it. Yes, you can trade and do business here, but don't meddle with stuff. You stay out of our business, we'll stay out of yours kind of idea. It kind of splits the world down the middle. And then you got Andrew Jackson coming up here with the nullification crisis, in which a tariff was put on goods from foreign countries to try and keep business here in America and stimulate the economy. South Carolina majorly affected by this because things were cheaper from overseas, but now they're more expensive after the tariff. Takes their economy and puts it in the dumps. They try to nullify the law and say we're not going to follow this. It's not constitutional, et cetera, et cetera. And they threaten to secede, which Andrew Jackson says, nah, you're going to stay here, or else I'm going to send in the military. That's the nullification crisis in short. Jackson also, through the Indian Removal Act, has the Trail of Tears happen because white Americans want the land that the Native Americans are on, so they get pushed to the west. On that Trail of Tears, 4,000 or so Native Americans, a lot of them Cherokee, die. And Jacksonian Democrats really despise the Second Bank of the United States because they have the idea that it favors the wealthy. Thus, Jackson allows its charter to expire and the bank ends. Problem is, this causes a panic of 1837, which is basically a depression, which the economy of the country is really not doing well. In the 1800s, you've got the temperance movement and the abolitionist movement coming from the Great Awakening, which religion's kind of reviving again. Women are trying to make alcohol legal and slavery. And this kind of goes into the right to vote here with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the Seneca Falls Convention, in which the women get together, plus other prominent supporters like Frederick Douglass and stuff, trying to get women's rights going here. This is really the beginning of the women's rights movement, which will culminate probably with the right to vote in 1920. Women want alcohol in particular illegal because men tend to get drunk and be abusive with it is kind of the rationale here. Then you got the North and the South here. North's more industrial, agricultural. In the South is a little more poor and rural, whereas the North is wealthy and urban. A little bit pro-slavery in the South and vice versa in the North. Cotton gin here in the South actually makes the South more dependent on slavery, however, because they can produce cotton much faster. Thus, they need the slave and the manpower to grow it. Thus, they need to keep the slaves. Manifest destiny here is going to be a God-given right, an idea that the United States will stretch from coast to coast. For a whole bunch of variety of reasons. This is going to lead to the idea of Americans are, the best nation out there, American ideals, etc., God's will, we're superior. Political things about getting territory, success of the Democrats. Plus, economically, there's resources, there's farmland, etc. And last but not least, the Mexican-American War. We kind of provoke Mexico to attack us, and then we say, oh, hey, we're the victim here. And this leads to a 2.5 year war in which eventually we sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which we get a new border between the United States and Mexico, the Rio Grande River in the south. We get California by it, and then it'll eventually become as a free state. And we get a whole bunch of territories, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and Nevada for a mere $18 million. So the size of the United States is expanding yet again after this. In 1849, kind of ending this here, we are after the Mexican-American War. We got 15 slave states, 15 free states. What happens when we want new states like California to come in? California wants to come in as a free state, and that's going to set off a whole bunch of problems. So there we are. There is topic 0 in a nutshell. If you guys have questions, just get a hold of me.